titled AudioEye Webinar Series.
Thank you for everyone who joined, and thank you for joining me for our intro to web accessibility for agencies and how to decrease legal risk while driving revenue. A couple housekeeping items for enabling automated closed captioning today if you need it. That's available by selecting the closed captioning button. Also, throughout the presentation, questions while I'm presenting can go into the Q&A box for the team. I'm going to go ahead and answer all those live at the end, and we'll get started in a moment. But first, let me introduce Danny Wheeler, who will be doing all the actual hard work behind the scenes and fielding your questions. Danny, if you want to pop up.
Thank you, RJ. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I'll be answering questions in the background and also communicating with our CPAC certified team back here to give you answers to your questions.
Thanks, Danny. Cool. So with that, we can go ahead and jump in and get started. So first thing I'm going to go over is our agenda. So the stuff we have going on today, we have about 5 main topics we're going to cover, the last main Q&A. So the first is web accessibility and ADA compliance for agencies. This is going to be an overview of ADA compliance and how you want to think about it and how you want to think about it from both your and your client's perspective. The second is analyzing your client's risk. This is going to be how to determine the appropriate risk assessment for your clients and then determining what response is warranted based on the risk allocation that you have. The third thing we're going to talk about is how to reduce legal risks, as in who's going to be responsible, and when that happens, how do you mitigate those risks? The fourth and most important, and generally the hottest topic conversation we do these, is how do we actually integrate this into your partner ecosystem, and how do we drive a revenue stream for your agency within accessibility while still creating a better experience for your clients? So what we find is higher adoption rates means better legal protection, and we find nothing drives adoption like monetization. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then finally, we're going to end it with Q&A, question and answers. So keep putting those into the chat, and Danny will feed those over at the end. So that's me. I'm RJ Heller. And as the slide says, I've been working in the accessibility industry for the past 9 years, so just under a decade. I started my journey in Washington, D.C., and I moved up to New York City about 6 years ago. I'm still working in accessibility all the way through. And as you can see from my background, I am not in New York today. I'm in our newest office out in Utah. We're very excited for the team we brought in out here. And in any case, I've seen the industry drastically evolve over the past 10 years. When I started, there was really no technology-based approaches, and the ones that existed were not really built out in the same way that they are today. There's also been a major shift in litigation that has really turned the tide of the industry and made people pay attention to digital accessibility. And we see this really happen in a meaningful way around 2016. And then this uptick in lawsuits drove more players into the space, and with that, more ways to approach issues, some good, some a little bit less good, but ultimately the progress is all being made in the right direction, and something that we're all very excited to see. It's been very exciting for me to watch and be part of the maturity of the space. To put this in a little bit of context, we at AudioEye have nearly 100,000 sites that we manage. Add that to all the players in the space and the consultants and the small shops, the big shops. We have collectively made the internet a dramatically more accessible place for literally millions of people. And the world is a better place by the work we've done collectively. So it's very exciting, and you can feel really good about the work we're doing. And your engagement today is only going to help forward that future for everybody and provide access. So with that, let's get into it. Cool. Web accessibility for agencies. So starting for this, it makes sense to identify and address, like, what is accessibility? So accessibility refers to an area of professional practice that helps organizations ensure they don't discriminate against people with disabilities. And they want to actively offer inclusive and equitable experience for all. So not only is this good for people, good for business, and the right thing to do, but it's also the law. So the US federal law prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, and this is called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Enabling access to built environments like homes, businesses, office buildings, healthcare facilities, parking lots, emergency services, streets, parks. These are all critical dimensions of accessibility. And what we're talking about today is the digital accessibility compliance, but this is just an extension of the ramps and rails that we put for those buildings that we see in the physical world. This is just the electronic side of that. So a direct comparison of what we're talking about in the digital space would be information and communication technology, like electronic documents, websites, web apps, learning systems, human resources, healthcare service. Essentially, everyone who visits a website or digital structure must be able to perceive, operate, and understand its content. Universal design principles, which is a big facet we'll talk about today, show that an increase in accessibility is an increase that's going to make world and life easier for everyone. So why is this important? According to the CDC, 26% of adults, that's just slightly more than 1 in 4, have some type of disability that's preventing access to content online. And only 3% of the web is accessible, according to WebAIM and the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice at Utah State University. More importantly, for the sake of conversations today, the Return on Disability Group reports that people with disabilities control nearly $2 trillion in spending power, and that combined with their friends and family is nearly $13 trillion in spending power globally. Accessible for some, accessible for all. We want to talk about access and what this actually means. So when we talk about people with disabilities accessing content online, we need to think about what does that mean and what does that process look like? To roll this back, let's think about if you're going into a building that requires an arm rail or a ramp to get around a set of staircase. If you're in a wheelchair, that's kind of straightforward. But if you're not familiar with digital accessibility, we need to talk about what they do. So if I was blind, I would be using a tool called a screen reader to access content online. So the screen readers can be Siri on your iPhone. It can be TalkBack on Android. It could be JAWS using a Windows browser. There's a plethora of different tools, browsers, and systems that all need to work together to be able to work. Now, JAWS can work really well with your desktop as it navigates your computer to get to your Google Chrome or Firefox icon. But then once it gets to the internet, you have millions of different websites built in millions of different ways, all kind of done differently, largely similar, but not in a way that necessarily communicates the best way through that screen reader back to the individual. So if I was using a screen reader and I go to engage and there's no alt tag on an image, that's generally something people are familiar with, then it's just going to read back JPEG 677774, and that doesn't give me any information. Or alternatively, if I'm trying to navigate through a website and it's not in the proper order, I'm jumping around, or I have to go through every single menu in order to get to the main content of the site, that's a very poor experience as well. And there's over 450 different tests within WCAG that we want to run to make sure that these websites are coded in a way that they can just talk to each other, and anyone visiting the site, no matter what tool they're using, is going to have a seamless experience. So talked about WCAG a little bit. What is WCAG and what does WCAG aim to achieve? Well, there's 4 main facets of WCAG. There's perceivable, there's operable, there's understandable, and robust. So what do we mean when we talk about that? So if I'm going to a website using any form of tool and I engage with the site, the first thing is perceivable. Can I understand what's on the site? So I found a button. I can find the button. I can know it's there. Okay, I perceived it. It's there. I'm engaging with the button. Operable. So I found the button. I can engage with it. I know it's working. Understandable. Now I found it. I can operate it. Do I know what I'm doing as I'm navigating through that site? And then finally, robust. Can I use that whether I'm using Siri, whether I'm using Braille output, whether I'm using any form of assistive technology with any type of browser or piece of technology, and it's just going to work. That's WCAG in a practical sense, but who are they as an organization? The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were created by W3C, which is an international governing body for internet standards that allows us to test for accessibility by defining success criteria for different elements like websites, forms, images, and text. So essentially, it's a set of standards that exists that we've all agreed on to say, hey, if you build your website to these standards, you're going to be extremely compliant and you're going to be able to provide the best experience for your visitors. Now we've talked at a high level understanding of what we aim to achieve. Let's talk a little bit more about what that means for your agencies and then also get into a little bit of the law around it. July 26, 1990, the American with Disabilities Act was signed into law. This is a form of the civil rights legislation that works to increase the inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of community life, including employment, education, and telecommunications. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in places of public accommodation. And this is where many digital accessibility legal battles are being fought. Under Title III of the ADA, and this is a mouthful, and I quote, public accommodations must have facilities that are accessible to individuals with disabilities and maintain them, make reasonable modifications to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to their goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, and accommodations, and ensure effective communication with individuals with disabilities by providing them auxiliary aids and services at no additional charge. So to surmise, it's saying all people need access to all content. And if you can't get it with where you are, you need to be provided aid to be able to have the equal access as the person next to you. As you can see from this slide, talking about lawsuits, it's a pretty crude trajectory, but you can see in 2017 to 2021, we're about 4x the amount of lawsuits that we're seeing in the industry. I'll get into the theory and history behind this later in the presentation, but the point with this is not an issue that you can just sit out and wait for it to blow over. It's not really a matter of if, but a matter of when you're going to have to deal with accessibility and deal with making your site accessible, or all the alternative, deal with the demand letter for inaccessibility. Department of Justice guidance, the Assistant Attorney General for the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division in March of 2022 published guidance that under the ADA, web accessibility is a requirement for businesses open to the public, and that WCAG is the standard for technical guidance. This is a critical development because the DOJ is essentially saying that digital accessibility is a priority under the ADA. But the most crucial point of that is people tend to think that WCAG is actually the law. As I said before, WCAG is not the law. It's the set of guidelines that everything points back to. So the DOJ is saying, build your websites with WCAG standards and best practices in mind, then you're going to be able to be compliant with the standards. It also extends out to Section 508 for groups that receive federal funding. Those also point back to WCAG. It's the global standard. If you're able to make your website WCAG compliant through either the help of a vendor or being able to do it yourself or a set of tools, you're going to be on a very good track. So let's talk compliant versus accessible. What does the law actually state? So on the left, there are the tenets of an accessibility compliance plan, which is the standard as referenced in several accessibility settlements that employ a structured negotiation model. So what we're saying is, if you do get a demand letter, these are going to be the things that you have to do to make your website accessible. While each tenet on the left is important to a successful plan, reaching all the objectives on the list still does not guarantee that the content is going to be accessible with people with disabilities. This is really the difference between compliance and usability. You still need to actually fulfill the promise of the compliance plan by acting on the results in a way that positively impacts people with disabilities. Audits and assessments find problems, they don't fix them. Knowing what's out there and having a plan is great, but you actually need to do the work too. So this is the difference between the letter and the spirit of the law, which is also where sometimes things get lost as you build and put a plan in place, but you're not actually having usability testers or people with disabilities testing it, people with screen readers making sure that while it makes sense, it actually is useful and usable. So analyze your client's risk. How are you going to know how to approach an issue like accessibility if you don't understand the risk or the severity? We can dig into that here. Typically, as an agency owner and you have your clients, these are the type of questions you're going to get. And this is how I would field them if I were in your position. So first and foremost being, hey, can I get sued? The answer to that is, unfortunately, well, yeah, 100%. You can have a fully compliant site and still get a demand letter or litigation that you're going to have to defend. And this is either on the agency or the client level. We'll talk more about how that relationship and partnership works later in the presentation. But this is why it's so important to have an accessibility plan or a third party that will provide an attestation of the work that was completed. We did this at AudioEye to help you be able to go and defend yourself. So the second one is, okay, can be sued. What's the likelihood? How likely am I to get sued? So this is a really interesting question that feels random or sometimes impossible to answer. However, it really boils down to the exposure of your site, the content you host, and the political leaning of your geography. What can I do to avoid litigation? You can do plenty. You can have an accessible site for starters. You can show who you partnered with to make your website accessible. You can provide a help desk or a feedback loop for engaging with people with your content. You can have a team that's available. But at the end of the day, the best way to avoid litigation is to make your website compliant, be doing regular checks and updates. So it's either integrated in your system or you have a vendor that's helping you to maintain that as well. There's benefits to both. And then what happens if I do get sued? First and foremost, I can't be more clear, don't panic. Identify if it's a demand letter or if it's litigation, read it carefully. Chances are your site was not actually tested in a very meaningful way, and you're likely part of a mass email or demand letter that's sent out from one or a handful of trial attorneys in the United States. That's the unfortunate reality of how this is built out and how this kind of watchdog mentality between the DOJ, lawyers, and WCAG works is they're what's driving the compliance within the industry, but they're doing it in a very broad way, which does not necessarily mean you're getting a hard look at your website every time you get a demand letter. So what's an effective response to that litigation? Following that same mantra of don't panic, the first thing you need to do is partner with a group that can help you become compliant, build an accessibility plan, and then work with that vendor to follow up on that plan. And once you have your feet under you, you can respond to it and respond in a meaningful way that actually has a plan and some weight behind it. Cool. Business profile. So for all the different agency owners we have, generally very verticalized. What type of business profiles are more likely to get sued? So somebody want to think about what's the profile of your business? Who do you serve? Are you a customer-facing e-commerce platform with millions of visitors a day? Or are you a lumber yard that has a handful of general contractors that you work with direct and you don't have a lot of traffic on your site? The former is obviously going to be a lot more susceptible to litigation than the latter. Verticalized. Are you part of one of the industries prone to litigation? So we see, and this is what we found throughout our time in the industry, law firms tend to send out demand letters in batches. If you're a law firm, you have a paralegal in for the summer, you're doing a high-level automated scan of 5,000 sites, and you're sending out 5,000 demand letters in a day or a week. 10% of those respond. So now that you have 500 people that you can focus on, you actually do a test of those 500 sites. Of those, you send a lawsuit to half. And as we talked about earlier, 97% of the internet is currently inaccessible. So you have 250 lawsuits, 97% are inaccessible. They're all going to settle at around $10,000 each. They just made 2.4 million in settlement fees in what took not really that long to do. So that's something to think about that also puts perspective on why this isn't going to go away within the industry. So that's a little bit of the legal side or something to think about. As far as audience, are you sizable enough that a lawsuit would be worth your time? Given what we just addressed a second ago, yeah, you probably are. And it's going to be worth the time to try to get a settlement out of you. And then audience, again, B2B or B2C, direct to consumer or large business to consumer that's going to have a lot of site traffic. Those are more susceptible than business to business groups that have less traffic. So the location state one is the interesting thing that I alluded to earlier. And it's important to remind everyone that WCAG are the guidelines that we adhere to, and the Department of Justice doesn't enforce those, lawyers do. We're starting to repeat on that. Are you in a state whose court system generally sides with the rights of individuals or business rights? Generally, more left-leaning states take the perspective that people, the individual should have right to equal access, and a little bit more on the other side on right-leaning say businesses have the right to operate as they need to with less government oversight, instructing them how to run their business. So lawyers are enforcing that the law is upheld, and as that rolls through the courts, you can see here California, New York, Florida's on its own out there, Colorado. Those states have generally more rights given to the individual, saying that those lawsuits aren't going to go as far as those states. Believe me, I know you're doing the best you can. The last thing anyone wants to deal with is a lawsuit. I've been doing this for a while. I've been on hundreds of calls with both businesses and legal teams of all sizes. I understand how frustrating this is for a business owner or an agency owner. We at Audio, I try to make this as easy as possible, and hopefully through this presentation here today, you can learn a little bit and help inoculate yourself against some of those demand letters and lawsuits. let's move into what specifically on a website makes you more likely to get sued. Traffic, talked about that a couple times. Higher volume of visitors is higher risk. The type of media that you have on your site, texts or many visual or videos requiring text or alt descriptions, motion graphics, dynamic content. Basically, the more that you have on there, the more likely you are to miss something. A grievance procedure. How easy is it for a visitor to report an issue that they encountered on your site? Part of WCAG is being able to have a feedback loop if someone has an issue with their site or they're running into an issue. Can they contact you? Is that contact channel for them to contact you accessible? Is it accessible within the types of disabilities that you're trying to adhere and help solve? These are all things to think about when you're talking about engaging with people with disabilities on your site. And finally, user experience. There's a lot of user flows and CTA forms, transactional forms of surveys, online payments that might be accessible. Is it just an all-around complicated site? Anytime you have more complexity, you're going to have more risks. You're probably more likelihood to miss something. The last portion in the risk assessment piece is which verticals are hit hardest right now. Some industries have historically and are currently more prone to ADA lawsuits and demand letters. Customers in these industries are much more likely to have end customers that are interested and willing to purchase accessibility compliance solutions. So these are something to think about as an agency owner when protecting your customer and grasping the appetite for these type of solutions. Based on what I've seen, and this has been a development of accessibility lawsuits in the United States. I talked about 2016 is when this really happened. We found the first industry to fall was the community banking industry. And I believe that this is because community banks are very decentralized. There's a lot of them in the United States. They have strong legal teams that understand regulation. And when they reviewed the lawsuits, they knew that they weren't going to win. They're small enough to not have the time or energy to fight these, but they do have the money to pay the settlement to make it go away. So they just pay out the lawsuit. And since there's about 3,200 community banks in the United States, this was a perfect use case at that point to start what we're seeing as far as litigation going out and tackling industries. So once the banking space was saturated, the next industry that we felt that followed was the automotive industry. And I believe it's because they're very similar in those regards. They're decentralized. They have enough money. They have big teams, including strong legal arms, and really no time to deal with it. And it's just kind of a nuisance. So that's another one that Blanket didn't pay out. So as we move out, you see that it's moved into more obscure. There's an era where there's all the art galleries in New York are getting hit. There's marinas, there's bicycle shops, coffee shops. It kind of follows a pattern. So that's when we talked about, are you within an industry that is feeling litigation and having it come? Chances are once it's in there, it's going to saturate all the way through until most people within that have either taken action or gotten some sort of demand letter. All that being said, we're aware of the risk. We're aware of what you can do. How do we reduce the legal risk and how do we actually make this better for your clients? So first, let's talk about who's actually responsible and who's implied to be responsible. So at the moment, the way it's written is your customer is the one who's going to receive a demand letter or get sued if their website is not accessible with disabilities. What it actually says is, according to established standards, the burden of responsibility lies with the website owner. But for your customers, this doesn't really matter. If they haven't done so already, they're going to turn to you for help in addressing these issues because they went to you to build a website, and they're going to go to you with help in responding to legal action. And since they rely on you for website maintenance, they might even hold you responsible, even if they can't hold you liable for the oversight if you ever get sued. So we want to be able to avoid that, help you get in front of that, to be able to continue those conversations and have that process with your clients, to be able to have the support for them and protect them in the first place. Because also, as we talked about, it's better business practice and they have access to that $18 trillion globally, which obviously sounds like a lot, to be able to make their sites compliant and do this the right way at first. What do we do to reduce legal risk? How do we actually run this? Well, first and foremost, you have to have a WCAG 2.1 compliance plan, which all of this can be done either with an external partner working internally. Have that plan and roadmap in place to make sure that your client sites are going to be accessible. You want to be able to provide legal support, because if you've done this right and done this in the right way, there should be a level of legal program to be able to help them respond to these inevitable demand letters that are going to come. You want to have an easy integration as well. So if you have a client, 100 clients, 1,000 clients, 5,000 clients, if you have an accessibility solution, it shouldn't be difficult to implement individually for all of your clients, because it's something that we need to get done. And with agencies especially, there's a lot of templatization or similarities across your site, that there's ways to do this faster and more efficiently. Integration and adoption piece is key, and that's going to be key when we talk about the monetization of this a little bit. If you're leveraging technology, obviously you want to have the best in class technology that makes this work for you, and expert audit services. We know that technology can do a lot to make websites accessible. It can't do everything. You still today absolutely need human testing by people with disabilities, be able to make sure, as you talked about earlier, that letter of the law and the spirit of the law, the usability versus compliance actually works. So if you want a usable website, you need people testing your site using assistive technology to make sure the user flows work and it works in a natural way. Finally, dedicated account management is part of that feedback loop that we talked about that's required within WCAG to make sure that people can continue to communicate back and forth with you. You can communicate with your clients, and that's all going to be part of that WCAG 2.1 plan. Adding new revenue streams, this is the part we put at the end because everyone's interested about. So what do we do, and how do we protect our clients, make the internet a better and more accessible place for everyone, and still put us in a position to drive revenue? Well, we see there's really two ways to break this out. You have your clients. You can either treat this in a upsell fashion and say, hey, we have an accessibility solution that we would like to adopt. We understand this is a big issue that we want to get ahead of. If you're interested, let us know. We generally see, regardless of the industry and regardless of the risk, whether website risk or industry risk, like we talked about before, all the different factors, with the upsell model, we generally see about 20, max out 30% adoption rate when we do that, which is because the clients generally look at this as an additional cost because they're unaware of their own exposure and risk. The common response you're going to hear from them is, well, why don't we wait till we get sued and then we'll see if it's actually an issue. But with that, you're tainting your reputation and their reputation as well, and providing more headache for you that you can negate and get ahead of before, while also still providing a better service for all of your clients. So that's why at AudioEye, we always suggest to our agency team doing the include route, or we call it our opt-out model. This is what we encourage your agencies to do, is build it into the renewal or create a time and point which you rolled out the program and require your vendors to opt out of it. So this lets them know that you feel this is an important enough issue that will be standard moving forward for all sites. It's going to be part of your ethos and ecosystem of your agency because you care about people with disabilities and you want to provide the best service with the information that you've gained and what you've learned being an authority and a point of intelligence for your agencies, that this is important enough that it's going to come standard. And when you ask your customers to opt out, they also agree that they're taking care of accessibility on their own and they can't attempt to hold you liable in the event of a lawsuit. So this does both. You get much higher adoption rates. We see in the opt-out model, we're at 85 to 90% of customer base sign up because they understand that it's important. They understand that you have a solution that's been vetted and approved and you provide legal support. In the instance that they opt out, they say, hey, I don't need this here. I'll take care of it on my own. Also, don't worry. If I do get a demand letter, I'll take care of it on my own. So you're covered in two ways, and you're still able to use it as a revenue driver because at least at AudioEye, our program is we give you a wholesale and our partners generally mark up what we do by about 100 to 200%. So that's a driver that you're able to have run out. It varies a lot based on industry, but the additional revenue makes this a no-brainer when you also combine what you're doing for people, how you're making the world a better place, and protecting yourself from litigation, which is really the big headache. All that being said, talked about the banking industry a lot in the very beginning. One of our oldest partners is Kasasa. As you can see, we average on their site about 10 unique remediations, accessibility fixes that are custom to them, delivered via our script, delivered via our code base, also custom authored because we have AT testers and people doing this work. We're about 10 plus per page. Since we started the partnership, our solutions been monitored on 32 million total page views. So people have clicked through 32 million times, leveraged our service, and nearly 100% of their customers are providing an accessible online experience. That's not to be confused with their customers have 100% accessible online experience, because that's also something that you always strive to adhere to. With web accessibility, it's a moving target. It's always keeping things as high as possible. But as a testament to that and the AudioEye and what we've aimed to do by being a good partner for them, they've had 0 lawsuits since we've started that. And they've been a partner for 5-6 years. So all that being said, we've talked about the industry. What is it? What is WCAG? How do we approach WCAG? Is WCAG part of the law? What does the law aim to achieve? How do we enforce it? How do we solve it when these things come? And now you're at the point of, well, what do we actually do when the rubber hits the road as far as accessibility? Well, there's several different options you can take to approach. And we talked about how this has developed in the last 10 years. And it really goes from a technology-based solution on the smaller side that's generally more inexpensive to a very manual-based approach, which is kind of a consultancy-based, which is more expensive and longer. I'll talk about both. As with most things in life and AudioEye as well, we think the answer is somewhere in the middle. So on the left end, you see you have widgets and toolbars. So this can be just things on the site that provide an ability to manipulate the site in a way that adheres to people specific disabilities. If you're not actually changing the website itself, and you're not making it compliant, sometimes those widgets and toolbars are a false sense of security. But also within that, there's groups that provide JavaScript-based automation that just says, hey, we're going to see a bunch of things on the site. We can fix 50-60% of it. Good to go. While that does get you down the road, it's not going to get you all the way there. It's like we talked about, you need manual testing. You need people leveraging assistive technology to get in there to make your website accessible. So when you combine the automation with the consultant-based approach, which is, hey, did we build out a program? Do we have a roadmap to be able to do this over the next 2 to 3 years? Do we have people coming in and testing? When we provide you the audits and services, you can go do it on your own. That's kind of the consultancy-based approach where you go back and forth with large vendors who are going to come in. It takes a long time, but it's really good. And it's going to get everything done. It's just very expensive. In the middle is where we find with Audio, which is our technology first solution, which is we leverage the speed to compliance that you can get with technology and what we can do to be able to lighten the load for our developers while still providing those changes, providing the consultancy-based approach, doing manual testing. The merger of both of them allows you to have the speed to compliance of automation with the completeness of human testing to make one full solution that's able to leverage both sides depending on where you are within the org. So like we said, I feel the answer is somewhere in the middle, but for each group, it's going to be different. The beauty with us is we can kind of do both, but the other side of it is every group's different. And you need to find what's best for you. You need to find what's best for your budget. That being said, if anyone does want a free accessibility audit of your page, shoot us an email afterwards. I'm more than happy to get that started with you. I'm happy to jump on a call and answer any other questions. It's always kind of strange for me doing webinars when you don't have any feedback throughout the whole call and you just talk to yourself for 40 minutes straight. But respond to the email and you'll get a complimentary overview and you could talk to me some instead of me talking at you the whole time. So that being said, I really appreciate everyone joining and questions. Danny, do we got anything in there?
We had a anonymous question. So they asked, how do I test for accessibility as a designer?
Well, it depends on the stage you are in the design process, right? There's a lot of tools out there that you can do after the fact, or you can be part of different programs like we have within AudioEye as well to integrate that earlier in your development process. Direct testing, AudioEye has tools. There's a lot of other free tools depending on the size of their agency. If you're a designer who's just getting started and learning things, there's free tools as well to get a baseline and understanding. All those link back to the W3C, which we talked about, where you can learn all the standards together. And as you get more into larger organizations that are building from a design perspective, we have tooling that allows you to test after the fact as you're pushing things and doing them live to be able to make sure those are compliant. There's other people in the space that do that as well. But basically it's a level of learning, education. There's programs online, there's CPAC certification through some of our other partners. There's a lot of ways to gain knowledge if you want to go that route, or there's the ability to design things and then test afterwards.
Great, thank you, RJ. And I'll add as an aside, if whomever asked that question, you feel free to email us and we at AudioEye, our design team runs through an accessibility testing process for everything we produce. And so our team has additional expertise that we'd be happy to offer. So David asked a couple of questions. Can you talk about accessibility within social media? Are there social media? Oh, this is a great question. Are there social media platforms that do accessibility well? Do you hear the same feedback as you do on websites? So I suppose a two-part question. Can you talk about accessibility more broadly in social media? And then are there platforms that do it well?
So that's a great question for like 3 different reasons, and I'll break it out. So when we talk about ownership of social media and your content, if you want to post, we'll use Instagram for an example. You can add text to your images with Instagram, and I know on TikTok for sure it increases their algorithm when you have alt text and words on the screen as it rolls through. So that's TikTok promoting as an accessible, it's promoting accessibility as a platform to be able to reward users by, when providing accessible content, you're going to be higher in the algorithm. So that's one way to look at it. I know TikTok does a good job. Instagram's also absolutely getting there. It's been a part of Instagram's ethos for a while. But as far as, hey, how do I make sure the platform itself is accessible? When you talk about tooling, it's very difficult if you are on other smaller social media apps. If you don't have access to their code base and you can't fix that, it'll be difficult for you as an end user to make that experience more accessible. And for that, if you find issues, you should be writing up to the owners of those apps and the large tech companies to say, hey, people with disabilities are using these, which they are aware of. We've met with a lot of them, but encouraging that feedback loop, which is part of the WCAG guidelines, is having an accessible feedback loop. If you're running into issues, they should have those in place, and that'll help rising tide raise all ships for those platforms itself. And then to the first part of the question, more accessible content is going to increase you within the algorithm to reward users with a higher level of visibility.
Awesome. And by the way, for any additional questions, please email audioeyewebinars@audioeye.com. And I will also drop that in the chat here as well. We have one more question that filtered in here. What are the downsides to just using a software plugin without any legal support?
Well, the lack of legal support, first off. But when you talk about just a software plugin, their software plugins can do a lot. And depending on, so this comes back to risk, right? So if you're an industry that is low risk, you're a very low client base, you're not doing a lot of revenue, you don't have the ability, you have a 2-person team and you don't have the ability to go out and learn because you're bootstrapped at a small company, do what you can to be able to move the ball down the road. And then as you grow and get to a position, hopefully very soon it's a high priority, you can involve more of that user testing to create a more accessible experience. And the reason I bring that up to answer the legal question is because the closer you can get to full WCAG compliance, it's always a moving target, always something you're trying to get closer to, the stronger your legal support can be and the stronger your response can be when you get a demand letter. Sometimes with just automation only, without any manual testing or without any template level testing or things like that, it becomes more difficult because you want to make sure that what was tested with automation is able to get you as compliant as possible. And every website's different. So you can have some sites where automation only does a little bit. And if that's the case and you get a demand letter, it's hard to fight against. But sometimes automation can do a lot because if you have small sites that aren't very complex, the user flows are easier. Automation can sometimes do more there. So it's a question of risk tolerance. And whenever you can have more usability testing and more manual testing on that, you're going to have a stronger response. And that'll be more ability to have legal support.
Great, thank you. Well, it looks like that was the last question.
Thanks, everybody. Like I said, I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate that people are here interested in web accessibility. And we're going to make the world a really cool place, and it's happening very fast. So excited. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out either to me or anyone on the team. And Danny, thanks to you for setting this up, and the rest of the AudioEye team, that the 15 to 20 people who put this together while I just sit here. Thanks all.